So I'll tell a little secret. So they asked if I could come to interview Rick, or maybe you asked if I was available. So I had two talks already planned in DC, which I just came from. I was like, no, we'll do it another time. And then I got the call. So I was like, you know what? I think I can find a flight. I'm going to be here because this is a once in a lifetime chance to have this kind of conversation in this moment. So I'm so glad to be here with you in this setting. So
I'm
thank you
so
all for asking.
yeah.
Thank the cosmos for having it all work out in this way.
Well, I wasn't going to do it if you weren't going to do it. So if you weren't going to come and be with me, I wasn't going to do it. So
So good. So it worked all the way around.
absolutely.
Um, so the theme of this year's festival is public, and so I thought it might be a good idea for us to basically just have conversations we have all the time, but in public. So I won't be like, "What kind of soup are you having today?" No. And I thought that it might be interesting to, um, because we are both people that have practices that are deemed kind of public and participatory, we also are both painters that will talk about each of those things a little bit, and the segues and or fissures that exist. So I'm gonna start with, hopefully I get this right. No, I went the wrong way. Okay, perfect. Um, so we'll start with.
Does anybody remember that quote?
Okay,
Uh,
extra M&Ms if you can tell us where's the quote from. Camille.
Dolly Madison. Who?
Baraka.
Barack Obama.
Obama.
Yep.
Um,
2006. Actually, that's a piece by Andrew Bowers.
is it
Yep.
beautiful?
Which on the outside was, I know I'm just getting all
No,
in your
go
mess.
for it.
Okay.
This is how our conversation go. Go for it.
On the outside was this quote, but then as you walked into the house, the back wall was like a video of all the euphoria of 2008 when he was being inaugurated, right? And then as you look at that for a while, and then you turn around, you notice there's a small television uh, with a video from a I don't know, it was like a town hall that he was having somewhere in 2010 or 2011, something like that. Anyway, and this person was asking him, or she was just kind of talking about how there was so much optimism with him becoming president, and and that she was so excited that he was president. But now, like 2 or 2.5 years in, she was just listing all the challenges that she was having, and she was like, what are we to expect next? It's kind of an interesting thing, right? His statement about what this country need, and then the euphoria of him winning to provide that.
Yes.
And then 2 years later with somebody questioning him about it. So it's just kind of it's a very interesting, provocative project. And of course, particularly in the third ward, because Andrew Bowers is white, third ward mostly black, and people didn't want anybody picking on Obama.
That's right.
Yeah, it's like, so that particular project was a little bit, it got a little bit of tension around that.
So that's actually a good segue into a question that I wanted to ask about the kind of it's not a confluence, the kind of this word community and this word public, and actually how they're not the same, and just kind of taking your temperature on constantly being framed in a way in which public and community are conflated. That's the word I want to use. Conflated right together when they're not necessarily the same thing, and they're not necessarily the impetus with why we start the projects in the way we do. So just wanted to toss that out and think about that. So that's actually interesting with that additional layer of like which community and who responds and who gets to have authority over what those responses are.
Right, right. And actually, as I was thinking about that question about the difference between public and community, it also something else occurred to me too. There's a third one that I always consider too. It's like neighborhood.
Yes.
Because neighborhood generally is geographically defined. Community is much broader, and then public is like it's this thing that's out there, that's kind of, I think that we aspire to, even when we're working within a community context, the point for doing that is to try to branch out beyond ourselves, right? We go into community, and with a hope that community would actually take us out even further into public. And that public is like, that's in a space where, you know, you can't expect the kind of uniformity that you'd find, within community. And so I think actually with Andrea's piece, I mean, I would say if I was to critique that piece, I would say from a neighborhood um, project, I think it was one, whether she was intending to or not, but it costs a lot of, kind of angst around that particular project. Whereas, from a community standpoint, I mean, I think it fit really well because many people were kind of asking that same question. So, yeah.
No, I think that's super powerful. I think also I tend to default to always assume that public means space. And I
Yeah.
think that's the assumption when people think about defining or describing the kind of work that you do. Maybe you can talk a little bit. I'm sure most people know extensively about Project Row Houses, but if you can talk just a little bit about, and even maybe in that context of neighborhood, community, and public, what was, what did you feel like in the beginning were kind of the things that were framing it in that realm? Was it really about community? Was it really about public space? Because in many ways, it's not public space. It's
Right.
actually interior space in a lot of ways. It's urbanistic in its scale, but it really is talking about something very interior. So maybe talk a little bit specifically about how your thinking evolved, or what was that first kernel versus when you were sort of like, is this a public civic
Right.
discourse? 'Cause it's not how we think about. We don't start like,
Yeah.
I'd like to create a public civic discourse around
Yeah.
dilapidated structures.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. But it's the same as like starting a painting though too. It's like you get an itch. It's like something's like I want to. There's something bothering me in this context. And so for me, at that time, it was being a volunteer in the Third Ward neighborhood, and and folks in the community were talking about the the kind of the lingering effect of the drug era of the 80s, and lots of kind of violence, dilapidation, disinvestment, that kind of stuff. And so I was just really thinking about it from that standpoint. It's like what are folks in the community really searching for? And they were searching for ways to kind of deal with these issues of blight, crime, and that kind of stuff. And actually, the funny thing about it, though, I remember how, oftentimes when community comes together or public, have a kind of sense of identifying something, sometimes those solutions are actually the things that create more problems in the future. So at that particular time, what the community wanted was that they wanted to just get rid of all these vacant houses that were being used for all kind of illegal activities, right? And then with hindsight, though, you can see that as they put pressure on the city to get rid of those properties, they were preparing it for gentrification. And nobody really thought about that, at the time, but it was, but the starting kernel for that whole project was just, how do we deal with this issue that this community of people feel that's valuable? And that was the beginning. I didn't know anything about like public space and that it was going to be a public project or whatever. But I could ask you the same thing though, right? About your projects though. I mean, in particular this last one, the tulips. Tulips, right? Yeah. I mean, what were your thoughts about that in terms of? I mean, because probably there were probably a little bit of a different starting point for me than you, because at that time I had no idea. I wasn't even in the realm of thinking about art projects, and I mean, I was kind of reading the Joseph Beuys stuff. I was just beginning to start, investigating the idea of social sculpture, but I didn't really have a grasp of it and what it meant. The project kind of helped me understand it, but now, I mean, you know all this stuff. You've experienced it. You've done other projects. So what was from that one? What was it driving it?
I mean, really, so you have to remember, so when you are starting to do this, I'm nearing the end of my architectural studies.
No, you were in third grade.
When did you start this? No. When did this start?
What? Like 92?
Yes, sir.
You were in third grade.
No, I
Come
was
on.
not. I graduated from high school 30
All
years
right.
ago.
Okay.
And went to architecture school. And then it was like, there's this dude. I know it makes you upset. There's this dude, and he bought up some houses. Like, is he an architect? That's us. We were like, well, who does he think he is? So, but being able to kind of watch the evolution of something like that at the same time that I'm questioning for myself, I've now gotten this fantastic education. I've had this lovely 5 years of just designing things so that they feel good and they're pretty. And then that's not really what I came here to do. And then this neighborhood that I'm going back to, even if I'm living somewhere else like that mentally, like what's my thesis? What am I applying this knowledge towards? And so it really then was this longer cycle of thinking about not only what these neighborhoods deserve, but also the kind of futility of just asking folks who haven't had resources and maybe aren't trained, like, what do you want? Because it is basic sometimes, it is ingenious sometimes, but oftentimes it can't see the whole picture because it's just trying to solve right now. So it was a long journey to start to think about what are these ways where we can do a few things. One is we can mourn that things go away all the time, even in other places where it's not an injustice. And then two, what are ways to have moments of joy or resilience and resistance and possibility, knowing that it's just going to keep doing it anyway. Like that is going to keep happening. There's systems in place that we can each keep cracking away at. But in the meantime, or in perpetuity, this is going to happen in places where brown people are. So there's a bunch of people tackling it in different ways. So I don't need to do what you do because you already are doing it.
Right.
We could try it again, but it's done.
Right.
Right? My counterparts that are here, Theaster, Emmanuel, they have their way of doing it. What's the strongest way I can really do that? So for me, it's this question of value and getting people to really think about the everyday. And so if the houses are not going to be there, but they are potentially cleared for this kind of moment of gentrification, what are ways people can really see the value before that moment happens? So can we recreate the houses, at least as the footprint, so that people can actually see that there was a thriving community here and how much community really is? Because when you go past a lot on an intersection, in your mind, you know better, but you're like, oh, there was a house.
Right.
No, there were 18 houses. This is like half of a block.
Right.
So, and then what is the amount of labor it takes to put this bulb in the ground collectively to recreate what should still be here? So there's a little bit of work and a little bit of pain in a way. I can't remember, somebody called me, they're like, my back hurts today. The next day. So literal pain, but like, you have to think about it as you're doing that act. But it's also something very beautiful and it's fun.
And
Kids
bringing
were,
all those
dumping the
people
balls.
together.
Yes.
I mean, that is like so much of, to me that I found was, the value of that stuff. It's like, all of a sudden you start getting all these minds and bodies together and you don't know where it's going to go from there.
You don't know the connections, but I think it's also important then to also be transparent about why is it that all these people will come down here because they like me and my crazy projects, but they won't ever do that on their own, or they won't invest. You were talking about earlier that the north side is so beautiful. You're like, oh, this is gorgeous. It's like, how on earth can this city, literally you draw a line and it looks like, we've stepped back in time, or like it's so desolate. And so it really begs those kinds of questions too. Most of the people that were in direct proximity to the work, they came, they took some sandwiches, they gave me a hug, they were like super impressed, and they went on their business. They weren't on their knees digging tulip bulbs, right? It's like the whole cadre of the private school my kids came, it was like 40 people came out, it's like, there's good and there's bad to that. And so there's a transparency that happens with that. And I think that that's important, and maybe a kind of spectrum that we exist on, where these kinds of things that you were starting, you can now walk totally away from this, and this is operating in permanence. Maybe it's changing in terms of who the artist is, or what segments are being evolved for what kinds of populations, but there's a permanence in the way it operates, and there's an impermanence in the way that I'm just constantly trying to get people to
Right.
just for a minute think about what's happening.
But but that part though of just having people come together, and that's the part to me that is, and the core of that is about community, trying to build community, and it is that community, I think, that allows us to get to this point where there's public, where it becomes public, because you know the community expands, and there are people that are outside of community that want to be in. That's the public, they want to be in it. And so therefore something like Project Row Houses starts as a community, you know, around the issue of a particular community, with a community of people that then reach this point of public, where there are people from throughout the city that found their way into that community in different ways, and some still remain as part of the public. They remain a part of the public by sponsoring things, by coming to things, and just that whole part. So there's a nice continuum, I think, but to me, the essence and the core of it starts at that point where you started this particular project, right? Giving people a reason to be a part of a community, and allowing that to set the foundation for public, a perception of public. Yeah.
You're more optimistic than I am. Because we both know. So while that is all true, we also know that all of a sudden, when these spaces that are civic or public or not claimed in a certain kind of way, when they become valuable socially, or they become valuable because artists do interesting things on them, then there's becomes a system or a cycle that then instantly commodifies the value, and it changes what it is. And so for me, it's also a work in progress to figure out how to then capitalize on that moment to protect the kind of preciousness of this kind of public, as opposed to ways that then it's like a small sign on the sidewalk that says, this is actually not public. Then you're walking on this sidewalk owned by Bank of America, and we're giving you permission to walk. I remember in San Francisco, there's like a little sign that says, really, the sidewalk is not public.
Have you seen that?
Yes.
You know,
and no one else seems to have seen it. And I'm like, do y'all see that we shouldn't be walking on the sidewalk?
I'm telling you, I was completely shocked. I wish we had an image of that, because probably most people don't see that. But in Houston, I was walking down the street, and I saw right next to this, I don't know, some corporate building, and it said, this is not public. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not public? This is public sidewalk. And so I kind of went down the rabbit hole, and I called the person at Public Works. I was like, why is this on there to say this is not public? And we went through that whole thing. It was amazing.
Yeah. So I think that's really critical, because then if you say public aid, public school, public defender, these are not things that people see optimistically or have an association that's positive. So I think for me, I'm just always a little bit reticent about the way there's a rush to kind of smooth over all these other kinds of publics that are not as well received. And we saw the confluence. Friend of mine, Lake Jayafis, calls it the Pandalucian Revolimic. In 2020, public health, all of a sudden, public health wasn't really everybody's issue, right? It's like, well, I want to go to my summer home, so I need to leave my home. And so that's your public health issue for you people that don't have insurance, or for you, right? And so there's a way that I'm always cognizant of how this kind of public optimism can quickly slip one way or the other into privatization, or into like, well, that's not really my issue that their garbage doesn't get picked up, these kinds of services. But I think that's also, hopefully I don't go the wrong direction.
Well, with that particular thing, that question though about public, and and where, I kind of see this, and I struggle with this notion of how society changes, right? I mean, can the public actually move things and
Mhm.
change things?
Mhm.
Whether it's public health, public education, you know, versus private money-driven kind of change. And I actually, you know, this is where I get a little jaded at this point. I don't know that our sense of power of public is nearly as strong as it used to be. I
Yeah.
mean, actually, there's a book on the table out there. What is it? The charade of the elite. Come on, wait. Who looked at the books outside? Um, oh God, what's
Now we all
his
gotta look
name?
at it.
I want.
It was about how these very rich folks that have foundations and things,
Yeah,
they give $10 million, or they even
yeah,
give $1 billion. It's like a fragment of something, so that there's not really ever moving the needle on hunger
yeah, the
or
Great Charade. I think that's the name of the
yes.
book. Yeah, and
He was a humanities
winners
winner
take
take all.
all.
He
Yeah,
was a speaker a few years ago.
winners take all. Yeah,
Mhm.
the Great Charade of the elite and how they're
Mhm.
gonna like change the world. And it's just it's basically that we don't necessarily believe that the public can do it. I mean, and this has been happening for a while, right? Even with Bill Gates that was going to fix public
Computers
education,
and yes, and
that kind of stuff.
libraries.
It's the elite that can do that. And
But then, in some regard, then the public is where the swell happens, where we see
mhm.
monumental change, but completely unexpected. Or like, so when the protests started in 2020, right? You're like, well, you all go on and march. You do that, and then it was like they're marching again today. They're marching again today.
Yeah.
Like day 12, we live on a boulevard. It's like day 12. We're like, better get our signs together and get out there and march. And marching at 4 o'clock every day. It's like there's a momentum that builds also that always tends to happen in an environment that's civic, but also always kind of described as public, the street,
Hmm. Hmm.
the kind of coalescing. So I think that's,
But speaking of that, then, well, this particular project though
yeah,
that we worked on together.
yeah.
First time we worked together, Black Wall Street Journey project. If you go back to the idea of Black Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
that was actually kind of almost an admission that the public could not do it,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
That you know, wealth building within the Black community, private wealth building,
Mm-hmm.
was the momentum for improving the conditions of Black people, not public sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I'm a, a socialist, deep down, right? But there is a sense that at this point in time, it's kind of like, um, I remember uh, seeing Paul Chan's piece in New Orleans for
Mm-hmm. Waiting
Prospect,
for
Waiting
Godot.
for Godot,
Mm-hmm.
and the conversation around that about how the people in New Orleans were like waiting for help,
Mm-hmm.
somebody to come. But at the same time, they were like, I think there was this article about this 13-year-old kid that went and took a school bus and just
Yep.
drove out.
And
It's like,
picked up people. Yep.
yeah, right. So there's this thing about public and private. I think that is an interesting time for that conversation to happen. In terms of right now, how are Black people? What's the best approach for Black people to move themselves forward?
Forward.
In terms of economic, um, uh, you know, economic sustainability, which also, you know, kind of filter out into all these other issues that are challenges for Black people. Is it the public sector? Is it going to be? I don't know.
Or a
It's an
mix, right?
interesting.
I mean, that's a great segue into this project, which is Black Wall Street Journey, and how we actually met. And Abigail is here, so either Abigail or Rick emailed me and were like, "Hey, are you available tomorrow?"
Well,
And I
but
was like,
but
"To
wait,
meet Rick Lowe?
but
Yeah,
but
right now. What time is it? Yes,
but
I'm coming. Where are we going? What's happening?"
But you know what's funny about that? As I think about that now, we're like a year out from that, a
Or
little bit more, whatever.
three.
Huh?
Three, Rick.
I mean, yeah, oh yeah. But at that time, Abigail was trying to herd like 30 something MacArthur geniuses, you know, at the time for that
Right.
project.
Yes, that's what the
Little
project
did
was
she know,
about.
little did she know she had another one in there too that she didn't know about. It was just coming along. You
I
know?
completely forgot that part. It's actually part of something. Yes.
Yeah.
When you came and you were like, I'm doing this research, and I think that Chicago is actually the modern day closest thing we have to what might be a Black Wall Street. I was like, okay, yeah, sounds right to me too.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go around. We're just gonna keep gathering people,
Yeah.
and we're just gonna convince everybody that this is true. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And Abigail was like, so have we agreed to do we're not sure what under not sure what circumstances? We were in my studio, right? And we were like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have.
That's
That
the
sounds
process.
that sounds exactly right.
Which
Yeah,
is
let's go.
which is also really it really speaks to the process of the work, I think,
Yes.
you know, and I think I see that in yours as well, that you know you just plow out there on this kind of hunch. And sometimes things like catch right away and you get momentum to move. Sometimes it doesn't, and then it goes back to that kind of thing I always tell my students, you know, if you're thinking about making work, whether you know whether it's any kind of work you're doing, there's a good healthy dose of being stubborn is okay, you know, because you know you have to want to do it, you know, and sometimes it's against everybody else's belief that it can happen or whatever, but you just do it, you know, you stay on it, and that's how great works of art come into being. That's how great public service come. All kinds of things come into being because people they have that stubborn quality, you know. So when it doesn't catch right away, they just keep going, and eventually it does, or it doesn't. You know, you just don't know.
Well, it's also the vulnerability, and so we talked about that too. That you know when you're so fixated on the thing, there's a willingness for vulnerability that's very different than if you sit in some studio and orchestrate a community or public project. You know, it's going to operate like this. Like it's not. You have to be like so zealous about what it is that you're ready for the bumps and the hiccups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we operate actually completely differently in terms of how we approach them. And so for me, it really was much more an opportunity to kind of be along for the ride and how you, because I'm very plannerly and have to have it all, a diagram gets drawn and, you know, but you were like, well,
Oh, I
let's
just
call.
show up.
It's like, I was driving and I saw a guy and then, do you know this guy? And then so it was me and Guillaume Foreman, Fahim Majid, had Natalie Moore, who we'll talk about in a minute, and Gwen Butler. We tried to get Tracy Hall. We tried to get some folks that are kind of philanthropic and in wealth and finance, and we just kept going. And we would make our little pitch, and then either they were on the bus or they weren't.
Yeah.
And then we go to the next place, and then be like, I don't think she's getting on the bus. And then we go to the next place.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also important because people wanted to celebrate the kind of clear, concise, like they can draw a nice little bow around what it was. And it really wasn't that we really were all brave enough to kind of be on this up and down and then be at a point where it was sort of like, at least for me, I was like, you know what, this is like when a painting gets muddy.
Yeah.
And so what I do when painting is muddy is I just turn it backwards.
Step back a little
there,
bit.
And then I go over there and do another painting.
Yeah.
And that's what I did,
Yeah.
right? Like I stepped back, but we decided that we would conspire to make Natalie a public artist. So Natalie Moore is a journalist. I'm sure everybody here knows that.
Which that was really a great
hilarious
thing.
So Rick was like, I think Natalie should do a piece as part of this. And I was like, yep, but you're going to ask her. She's going to say no. She's going to say this is why. She's going to give you 3 reasons. And then you're going to say yes, but. And then you're going to tell her. Then she's going to call me. Then I'm going to say, yes, you have to do it. And what happened?
And that's literally exactly the way that it went. I mean, I would talk to a man, and she said she's going to say no, you know, and blah, blah, blah. But then just tell her to come talk to me. And then and it just went. And then she did it. And it's amazing. Yeah, I mean,
I don't have the other picture of the actual bus ads. And I'll go fast because it's almost time for us to stop, and I want to get to the paintings. But the piece that we ended up developing, which was drastically different than anything we'd imagined, was based on Natalie's ongoing interest in utopia. And so we decided to use words, which are her medium, and think about public realms, which are bus ads or bus, placements, and work to get these questions that she was asking or these statements that she had placed on these bus ads. And then at some point, the speech was deemed political. And so the advertising company was not willing to put the ads up. And so the ads appeared in the Smart Museum as part of Abigail's exhibition, but the ones that we were able to negotiate be on the bus benches. Because at some point I was like, well, tell him to go home. I didn't say home. And then Rick was like, no, I think there's an opportunity here. So, right, I was like, I got an opportunity, And so we picked one, which is, I think the one says, what would Chicago utopia look like? And then they were populated, I think, in over 80 bus locations around the city. So in some way, that message gets deployed and has a different resonance in those places. And so it's a really powerful kind of confluence of ideas about public, but also who gets to decide what's important or valuable as conversation in addition to this idea of financial wealth. So I'm going to jump, and we can come back if there's questions.
Well,
but I want to.
If you're going to paintings,
I am. Because
I have a question though. While you figure that out, so the question is about your paintings, but
here.
No, that's a clock. I think that's a clock. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, maybe it didn't want to show any paintings.
You don't want us to see.
No.
Okay, you start talking.
They didn't want to show any paintings. Yeah. Okay. But no.
And
Okay.
then if I do enough of these, they're as big as your paintings, which are huge.
Yeah. Right.
I'm gonna do his paintings right here, like get bigger and bigger.
But let me. Okay. So you were saying earlier, which is very true, right? Like from community kind of stuff, we very differ in terms. I mean, 'cause for me, I just show up and I just try to like figure out where the vibe is, what's happening, who's interested, what this, that. But you like to organize stuff, right? Your paintings, do you do the same thing in your paintings? Because I do the same thing in my paintings.
Yes, I do the same thing in my paintings, but it doesn't look like it.
No, it doesn't at all.
How do you know?
How
do you know?
Yeah, that's so funny. I'm curious about that because people ask. My paintings are kind of the same. I just start them, and they just turn to whatever they want to turn into, and so I don't have a set notion of how they would go.
You don't.
All right, you messed up again. So.
Oh, did I go too fast?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
This is it. Rick.
Yeah. So okay. So like that first one though. That first one was just purely. No, you don't have to go back to it. No, stay where you are. Okay. That first one though was just it's like it's just colors. I spent some time at a friend of mine's garden, and I was looking at those colors popping. They were bright and all this stuff, and I just went back to the studio, and it just kind of came out that way, It's like, but then there's stuff like this piece. This piece is called Victoria Square Project 1, which is a piece that is my impression of Athens, Greece, where Victoria Square Project is. It was a project that was started with as a part of Documenta 14, and in 2016, 2017, it opened in 2017. But so sometimes they are kind of have a sense of content in a sense. Like this one, there were like these three like focal points. Like down here was like the downtown area, I guess, where the Parliament is, and Syntagma Square there. And then over here is this square, Ammonia Square, and then the one up at the north was Victoria Square, right? So I just had these ideas of things that I wanted, but and then it was just about color. Then once I had those things in, then I said, okay, now, so what's, because this was painted during the pandemic, right? So I wasn't going there. So it's my way of just kind of calling up the palette that I had
From memory.
from memory, and in hope that the piece and the paintings serve as a holding spot for something that was public, but ephemeral in a sense, that may change, may exist, may not exist. That project's still going. It's still going now, although we're going to sunset it in December, I think. But
In
it had
Athens.
like a 5-year plus run, on that project. And but so after it closes, there is a series of Victoria Square project paintings that will kind of hold
Commemorate
that
or hold
as
that
an
memory.
idea. And and in a sense, it and I know we have notions of what we call public. Public is there. It's a term and it has a definite meaning, but I kind of twist it a little bit because I like to think of it as being able to get to people in places that I don't know, that I'm not connected to. And so, works like this, it's an opportunity to, quote unquote, reach a public. It may be in private,
Collections.
ownership and that kind of stuff, but when it goes out for display, it is going to a public that had no relationship to that particular place. And that's my way of kind of pushing that work forward. But your paintings, though, like the ones that were shown recently at
Gagosian in
Gagosian,
June.
but they had a particular theme about them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm blown away that you were describing it because their mappings, I don't know how accurate this is specifically from like a plannerly point of view, but there's like a kind of language you're using to describe a psychic space and a physical space potentially, and this idea of like branching that to the public. And I'm almost the antithesis in terms of like painstakingly getting a palette of colors that a very particular community is going to associate themselves with, and then making sure they're physically in the room, basically. So using the candy lady who doesn't exist anymore, and like conjuring these colors to be the stand-in, and then really the materiality and the understanding of that is like painstakingly thought through, and then it's just all of that as a palette to create the thing. So is deliberately not trying to have anybody say, I think I see her dress, or there's a piece of candy. So, but it's very difficult to kind of reach that stasis between being something that somebody immediately can understand and feel like it gives them value in the space, and also not being kind of representational in a way of what the object is.
Right.
So they're both kind of doing that, but
Yeah.
in kind of very different realms.
Yep.
I'm getting the signal to
Oh,
shut
okay.
it down a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
But I will say that I think it's also powerful for people to understand that there's a way that you're making associations between the work that might be deemed public and this work that might be deemed studio or object based. But really, in your mind, there are some synergies where there's like bodies of work that go along with maybe what you're thinking about at the time, or specifically that place.
Yeah.
So I think that's powerful. We talked earlier about the idea that people love this kind of neatly contrived story that artists make work where everything makes sense all at the same time, and we're mapping that out in that way. And in fact, it's not. We think about things in different ways all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, just even the notion of public. I mean, I'm always questioning what is public, and I'm always trying to find it and better understand it, because, and the work helps me do that too. It helps me kind of shape my understanding of public and how I want to, how I want to see myself acting within this public realm. So,
All right, that's a good place to stop, and then we can invite you all to join our conversation. So,
thank you.
Yes. Alrighty, thank you all so much again. Alrighty, folks, for folks in our audience here, we're going to be going up and down the aisles, my colleague Baylor and I. We're going to do one side at a time, so we're going to hand the mic out. If you have a question, please raise your hands and get on deck. The couple things we ask, just please let the presenters know your name. Make sure that when you're asking a question, your statement ends in a question mark. And perfect. Anybody want to ask the first question over here? Going all the way up to the front here.
Note he said, make sure we know your name, because I'm going to fine you if I don't like it. I'm going to fine you later.
Sorry, Rick. I'm not used to a mic. My name is Dave. I'm from Evanston. I'm an architect, and I've enjoyed the conversation, but selfishly, I was wondering, I don't know you at all and don't know your work. I was wondering if you can speak or interested to speak to the path as being an artist, number one, your path, the choice of the art you do, and maybe the creative process that you work with. And just a technical question, how big are those and what medium?
Like bigger than
'Cause I really
this.
like
They're
them.
bigger than this.
That was a little bit, probably a little bit bigger than that. Just a little bit. Maybe about this size. Yeah. Yeah. That's about the real size. Yeah. No, it's not.
They're huge. They're
No,
huge.
it's smaller. I'm sorry. I'm looking at chips now. That's not right. Anyway, the path, quick just path, started as a landscape painter, but wanted, just because I didn't know art, I didn't do art. I went to a very small school in Georgia, and that was the thing that they taught, landscape painting. And but I wanted to paint paintings that dealt with social issues that I was concerned with. So I went from that, and I started doing very didactic kind of political paintings, specifically done so that they could not be collected. I would do them in conjunction with groups like Amnesty International. If they were having Human Rights Week, I would do installations for that. I would do installations dealing with the last big installation I did. It was an installation that dealt with issues of police brutality. And then I felt like that wasn't doing what I really needed it to do, and then I shift to this social sculpture, which led to Project Row Houses, which was a reclaiming of a block and a half of little shotgun houses that evolved over time to many, many blocks, and building community there. And then to a point where, I was just, had a little angst about that and wanting to find other ways to do things, and moved into painting. And this time the paintings came in the form of, abstraction. And I'm still working on, community engaged projects. Black Wall Street Journey, which is still here. So that's kind of the trajectory. And your other question was like just
Technical.
Oh, yeah. Amanda kind of hit upon it. My creative process is one of just, I believe, from my understanding of social sculpture. Anybody know that term, social sculpture? Joseph Beuys, German artist, coined this term, social sculpture, back in the 70s. And he kind of defined it as the way we shape and mold the world around us. And he had a critical part of it was that everybody is an artist. And so the way that I interpreted that was that, maybe if I can transform a community, a neighborhood, smaller than the world, but just a neighborhood, and as social sculpture, that would mean that, it should be a process through which everybody could bring their creativity to the process and be quote unquote artists. And that's the thing that kind of drives me in my community engaged work is, creating platforms, structures, or whatever, so that folks can just come into the process and bring what they have, and it kind of validates the creativity of local folks. One of the big challenges I had was with, I don't know if folks remember a book by Richard Florida back in the early 2000s. It was called The Rise of the Creative Class. And I was on a couple of panels with Richard Florida, and we kind of bumped heads a bit, right? Because, the idea of the rise of the creative class gave value to creativity and creative folks, which is good. But what it did was it suggested that there was a class
Yes.
of people, which mean that you had to bring people to communities and cities
Correct.
to supply creativity, ignoring the fact that there's creativity that exists within communities. And so that was kind of my, push. We kind of bumped heads on that a bit, and that drives my process, is trying to figure out how, to encourage and nurture the creativity of folks within community.
Hi, my name is Lori. Thank you for taking my question. Amanda, you mentioned public health, public schools, and the negative connotations that that public word has with those items. And I remember many decades ago hearing that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And therefore, if it's public and publicly funded, then the answer you have to answer to who's paying for it. And the sense that I don't want my tax dollars going for whatever seems to be really pervasive in America. So getting to community to public art that has some funding or financial backing seems to be a really difficult task. If people buy in and their community, you have then the support. But how do we get enough money and still have people have creativity and freedom to do what they need to do or say if it's public?
That's an excellent question. I'm so glad you framed it like that. So people were asking this a lot last week with these tulips. So we've both been fortunate enough that the artwork is starting to be the economic engine, right? So, but then, we get the check. So whoever bought the painting doesn't get to decide what I do with the money. So I bought $50,000 worth of tulips because I could, right? I didn't know I was about to win $800,000. So that was just icing on the cake. But that still, in some regard, is the pain of the piper, right? So while it's unrestricted, there's still this notion of like, well, if you're not a grant winner, how are you funding your project to do X, Y, or Z? And so I think that we in Chicago are in a unique moment. We have so many artists. We're a creative class, not in the way you're describing it, but where the planning department or the mayor's office is calling us on a regular basis, which sometimes seems good, but it's not when you're like, are people there who work and get paid to do what you are asking me to tell you to do for free? But so that's an exciting moment when elected officials think they should go to artists in the same breath that they would go to policymakers, and that we have the capacity because of our training to actually answer these in an informed way and also in totally preposterous ways. So I think we're hitting on something. We're in the midst of it, though, but there has to be, in the end is capitalism, so there's got to be some sort of way that the money is coming, but how can we be more strategic in controlling how that happens so that there aren't these conversations like, well, you can't put those billboard signs up because we own the advertising company and we decided that, the word whatever is political. It's like, really?
That
Right?
happened. Yeah.
So so in that instance, my response was to say, we're not going to use their bus benches. We're just going to walk around and hand out flyers, or so that there's also an understanding that you can't control me with money. Predatory lending was political.
Yeah.
Not as yet for me, but I know that is a real problem, and that also I have benefited from a generation of artists that had to endure that and also get blacklisted for that, so that I can just stroll into whatever project I want to be in, right? Like there's also a kind of homage that needs to be paid for that, where I feel like I should be doing more to make sure that I'm honoring the fact that they were left out of history, or that they don't have the financial resources because people decided their work was not valuable. So.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to add a little bit to that, and just kind of how I'm muddling things around in my head about public-private, it's so sometimes I think that we distrust public in ways that comes back to bite us, at different points. We don't realize that it's an asset and a resource to us, that we do have more control over public than we do private, right? And I manifest this in a painting I just did recently about kind of called Hindsight, Project Horizon's Hindsight, right? But where in the Third Ward neighborhood where we were beginning to do work, there was this threat of gentrification, and the real threat people felt was coming from the University of Houston, which was nearby, and there had been talk about, the Olympics were coming. They were doing a bid for the Olympics, and the University of Houston was going to control these houses and all the stuff that was coming to Third Ward, and it was going to take over the Third Ward neighborhood, right? And so there was a community pushback and an agreement that said that the University of Houston would not develop to the west of this one street that's called Scott Street, because that was the heart of the neighborhood. And so they managed to get the University of Houston to kind of redirect their thinking, and they started to go to the east, develop to the east. Well, they were successful in keeping the University of Houston out, but then looking 20 years later and realizing while we were keeping the University of Houston out, the public sector out, the private sector was just dry. They were just buying real estate. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, now I tell people, if that was the University of Houston doing stuff, we could at least yell and scream at them and say, we're going to tell the state to cut off your money. But you can't do any of that with the private sector. And so all of a sudden, that campaign against the public turned to, bite us in the rear. Yeah, so that kind of stuff happens. But anyway.
Alrighty, folks, we are running right up on time here. So just while we're at it, it's right at 1 o'clock. Any final words you two want to leave our audience here with today?
Yes, go see Rick's show on
Yep.
Tuesday at the New Bauer Collegium for Culture and Society, 5701 South Woodlawn Avenue.
Yay!